Thank you, Rob, for that generous introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm really very honored and very moved. I also had the pleasure of meeting John Butler a few times. He was a renowned senior scientist. I was a junior fellow, but he would come to my posters at the American Thoracic Society meeting. When I saw him first approach, I got kind of nervous because of the difference in our stature, both career-wise and physically. But he was nothing but enthusiastic and interested and supportive. And if he had criticisms, they were delivered in a way that were just so kind and gentle. And that was particularly striking because it was like nothing that I had ever encountered at Hopkins. But to me at the time, Seattle seemed like it must just be this mythical center of civility, good manners, hospitality. And it really took many years and several visits to Seattle before I realized that this is actually true. And demonstrated perhaps most so on this invitation. So I struggled a little bit as to find a topic that would be of interest, or at least potential interest, to a wide range of people, but about which I also had some expertise. And I finally realized that I have a lifetime of experience with failure. Maybe one of the world's experts in failure. So I'm going to talk to you today about failure. I have no conflicts of interest. It's pretty hard to make money by failing. But the points that I want to cover are to convince you that failure is a necessary prerequisite to eventual success, that the response to failure helps predict whether or not you will succeed. But success is hard, and you're going to have to fail over and over again. But that more adaptive responses to failure can be taught and learned. So I think the easiest of these to dispose of is failure as a prerequisite to success. So using a primitive audience response system, I'd like you to just raise your hand if you've ever been turned down for a grant. A few people. How about if you've ever had a paper rejected? And it may be harder to define this as a failure, but it certainly feels like a failure. Have any of you lost a patient despite doing everything right? Yeah, lots of nods, lots of hands. So basically, we have all failed. We've all failed many times. Yet here we sit, trainees or faculty at one of the premier institutions of medical care and higher learning in the country and the world. So all of us have managed to succeed despite these failures. The literature on failure and response to failure goes back at least 50 years. And this was an experiment that really started the literature and the concept of learned helplessness. I used to be an animal investigator, physiology investigator in an animal lab, but even for me, this experiment seems a little bit gruesome. So I'll describe it for you. So Seligman and Mayer took 30 dogs, divided them into two groups of 15, and they put them in a cage where they were subjected to an hour and a half of painful shocks. One group of dogs had a lever in the cage, and if they figured out to press that lever, it would stop the shock. The other group, the cage was identical, had the lever, but the lever didn't do anything. And the average duration of the total duration of shocks in both groups of dogs were equal. The next day, they were placed in what's called a shuttle box. It's a cage that has a partial divisor between the halves of the cage, and one half was electrified where the dog is placed. If they jump over the divider, the other side is not electrified. And then they would expose the dogs to painful shocks and see what they did. And all of the dogs that had been in a situation in which they had some control over their shock the previous day would escape the shock when they could, whereas only about 1 in 5 dogs who had had no control over the duration of their shock would attempt to leap over the barrier. So they just sort of stood there helplessly. And this concept of learned helplessness has been applied to humans in socioeconomic conditions and all sorts of other applications over the 50 years since then. So at least some aspect of your response to, in this case, pain, but you could easily translate this to life's failures, is whether or not you have some control over them. But the mindset, the frame of mind with which you start, also has some influence in your response. And Carol Dweck and colleagues have developed these concepts of mindsets, which they call a fixed mindset or a growth mindset, also known as an entity or incremental mindset. People who have a fixed mindset believe that ability is a fixed entity. It's inherent, and if you're incompetent, you are unalterably incompetent. That is, practice is essentially futile. People who have that mindset tend to choose performance-related goals. If they're typists, they want to type 60 words a minute, or they want to empty their inbox every day. And they tend to be relatively risk-averse in the sort of challenges that they undertake and decisions that they make. People with a growth mindset believe that ability can grow, but it requires effort, so there is utility to effort. They tend to pick mastery goals. They want to be the best typist in the pool. They don't just want to pass the test, they want to get the best grade in the class. And they're folks who are much more likely to undertake challenges. And what mindset you have when you start has been shown to predict your achievement in various challenging situations. So this was a study of 373 students entering 7th grade. First of all, my hat's off to anyone who can study middle school students. I'd rather do studies in Tasmanian devils, but they did this. In a New York City public school, they gave them surveys to categorize their belief system, a whole bunch of different psychological surveys on their theory of intelligence, effort, beliefs, helplessness, responses to failure. I'm not a psychologist, but they are. The baseline data was a standardized citywide math aptitude test that everyone takes upon entering 7th grade, and then their outcomes were the math class grades. So over the next 2 years, students who had an entity or a fixed mindset, their grades remained stable, but the students who believed that effort could improve their grades actually proved that because their grades improved. So the first lesson about failure is that you should believe in yourself. And that may translate into success. But not necessarily. There's been hundreds of years of interest in trying to discern how much of success, genius or career success, is inherited, how much of it is intrinsic, and how much of it is due to practice, environmental factors that anyone could overcome. One of the first people who looked at this is Francis Galton, and I have to read the description of Francis Galton from Wikipedia because I can never remember all these things, but he's described as an English Victorian statistician, progressive, polymath, sociologist, psychologist, anthropologist, eugenicist, tropical explorer, geographer, inventor, meteorologist, proto-geneticist, and psychometrician. So it puts you triple threats to shame. But among other things, he's credited with the concepts of correlation and regression, variance, and standard deviation are his contributions in the field of statistics. And he was a contemporary of Darwin's, became very interested in natural selection, and was particularly interested in how much of genius or success or renown could be attributed to inheritance. So he classified several hundred English gentlemen according to their reputation. These were in diverse fields, athletes, legislators, scientists, and also classified them according to what he called their natural gifts, basically their grades in school. And then he did a correlation to see whether or not these related to each other. And he concluded in part that no man can achieve eminence without being gifted. Few who are gifted will fail. Now, I think this is a very English upper crust kind of conclusion. Sorry, Rosemary, I don't mean to disparage you. But every time I open the newspaper, I'm faced with someone who has achieved eminence with no evidence of being gifted. And our poor neighborhoods and our underdeveloped countries around the world are filled with people who have great gifts, but for whom circumstances have not allowed them to translate those gifts into success. But another part of his conclusion was that ability combined with zeal and capacity for hard labor were predictors of success. Zeal and capacity for hard labor. And this concept has been developed by several other investigators, most recently by Angela Duckworth. Professor Duckworth is a PhD psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, MacArthur Prize winner, and she, based on her experience teaching at a lower-income elementary school in New York City and an elite math high school in San Francisco, she started to wonder why some students succeeded and excelled and why other students kind of languished, despite what seemed to be equal degrees of aptitude. And so to study this, she undertook a PhD and came up with what she terms the grit scale. She developed this by having surveys that visitors to a website called AuthenticHappiness.com. It's a website that's run actually by Martin Seligman, the guy who did the original work on learned helplessness. He's now turned his attention to learned optimism. Through these surveys, she was able to use statistical methods to parse down a relatively short series of questions with a Likert scale response that allows people to rate their grit. And the questions are of two types. One relate to persistence, and another relate to, she says, passion, but it's really singularity of focus, whether you're persistent with a single thing or whether you go from topic to topic throughout the course of your life. I think persistence and singular focus probably just wouldn't have made as good a book title. But at this point, she's written the book on grit. Oops. So I became interested in this and started to read more and more about it. I wanted to have our incoming class of medical students take the grit scale during orientation. I thought that would be a good way that they would get some insight into themselves before they started medical school. This was vetoed by the guy who runs our student advisory program. Clearly a much more sensitive guy than I am. But he was concerned that the students who did poorly on the grit scale would just be devastated. You know, here it is, their first test in medical school, haven't even gotten out of orientation, and they fail it. And they might start thinking that maybe medicine wasn't the right career for them. I'm thinking, well, maybe that's the idea. But nevertheless, he prevailed, and we haven't dared to administer the grit scale yet. As I started reading more and more about this, I also became interested in whether this was an emerging trend or whether I was just noticing it more and more. So I went to this Google tool, Ngram. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's an amazing tool that will nearly instantaneously identify the frequency of use of any word or phrase in the entirety of the digitized published literature. It does it instantly over 200 years. So I was looking to see if there was an uptick in references to grit. There wasn't in contemporary times, but I also became interested in these other peaks. So, you know, if you think of what happened during that time, World War I, World War II, the Depression, there was probably a lot written about grit. This earlier peak was kind of curious. It happens to be when sandpaper was invented. And then the movies, either the original or the pathetic remake, had really no influence on the corpus of literature. There has been more and more written about resilience. And resilience is a term of interest, a field of interest throughout education, industry, healthcare. It's a related but slightly different topic. So resilience is the property that allows us to put up with the daily, relentless, soul-sucking things that make us burn out on our job. You know, the EMR, the flood of online modules that we have to take, all of the regulatory burdens from all of the agencies. Dealing with that is resilience. It's about enduring. Grit is more about excelling. So Duckworth studied some correlates of grit. She found that it increases with educational level. It either requires grit to put up with years of education, or perhaps education helps build grit. Even adjusted for age, it increases with age, adjusted for education. It correlates best with conscientiousness. So this is one of the domains of personality among what's called the Big Five. It's just a format for describing aspects of personality. So it's conscientiousness, openness to new experience, extroversion, neuroticism, and agreeableness. Anyway, grit is closest to conscientiousness, which is characteristics like being dutiful, being organized, following through, stick-to-itiveness. But there's very incomplete overlap. It correlates with the lifetime number of career changes, correlates inversely with the lifetime number of career changes. And it also predicts success in circumstances that are likely to generate failure. So this was a study that was done in an incoming class of West Point freshmen. And they begin West Point with what's called Beast Barracks. It's a summer of just grueling physical, mental, emotional work. It would last like an hour. And it has about a 20% dropout rate in these students who've already been admitted to West Point. So she got consent from 1,218 of the 1,223 incoming freshmen. So for those of you who do clinical research, I just want to point out, this is a great population to do research in. This is like a 99.9% consent rate. West Point freshmen. She administered the grit scale, another scale called the self-control scale, the whole candidate score, which is an amalgam of different factors that all applicants to West Point are rated upon. Saw what it correlated with. It correlated only with the self-control scale, but among the various things that were measured, it was the single best predictor of making it through Beast Barracks. The 62% higher likelihood of making it through the summer without dropping out per standard deviation of grit. If you look at an even more grueling form of military training, 677 candidates entering into special ops training. And this makes Beast Barracks look like the summer of love. For this study, she measured the grit scale, standardized measures of physical fitness, general intelligence, the years of schooling, a variety of other factors. For these already highly trained soldiers, there's a 42% dropout rate. So it gives you an idea of how difficult this training is. But grit was an independent predictor of completing training with a 32% higher odds of completion per standard deviation. In many other settings, it predicts a 6-month job retention among timeshare sales representatives. So, if you're cold calling people for timeshare, you have to be able to deal with failure. And in fact, the dropout rate over 6 months was higher than the dropout rate for special ops training. It was 55%. But it was predicted by their grit score. The number of times that kids will make the finals at the Scripps National Spelling Bee, public high school graduation rates among 5,000 entering junior year in college and in high school in Chicago predicted their graduation rates 2 years later. Among a 4,700 person study conducted online, it correlates inversely with the likelihood of divorce. Oddly, just among men, but not among women. So if you're gritty, you're less likely to be divorced. And among the other big 5 characteristics of personality, openness to new experiences correlates positively with the likelihood of divorce. And then in medical training, in medical training, among surgeons, it's been shown, baseline grit has been shown to predict increases in burnout rating over 6 months of training. So clearly there is some overlap between resilience and grit. Now in regards to this, how much is intrinsic, how much can be learned, Anders Ericsson at Florida State University has taken really an extreme approach, I think. Through studying musicians and analyzing others' data on chess masters, athletes, typists, very specific skills, he's come to the conclusion that what it takes is 10,000 hours of practice. But it's not just practicing, it's what he calls deliberate practice. By deliberate practice, it's thoughtful, it's coached, it's deconstructed, so a complicated behavior is broken down into steps. These steps are practiced over and over again. And I would say that is a process of, a very specific process of trial and error. And the repetitive error under safe circumstances and in the presence of feedback are key features of building skills through this 10,000 errors, 10,000 hours, yeah, with 1 error per hour. He says it's 10,000 hours or 10 years. Medical residency is only 3 years. If that worries some of you, if you're working 80 hours a week with 4 weeks per year off, that comes out to 11,500 hours. So don't worry, there should be time. This is a figure for one of his papers showing the accumulated hours of practice among pianists as they age, including what were considered expert virtuoso pianists and amateurs. And you can see that there's a striking difference between the hours of cumulative practice. Now, he also made these measurements in piano teachers, and I'll tell you that they were down here right near the amateurs. So I think this is empiric evidence that those that can't do, teach. But persistence and passion have its limits. So I think I'm a pretty persistent person. I kept after my future wife for 10 years before she agreed to go out with me. Fortunately, restraining orders were not commonly used back then. It was really a test of wills. And our 35th anniversary is next month, so I continue to persist. But when I was early in high school, I saw men's gymnastics on TV for the very first time. So gymnastics on the East Coast, not nearly as popular as it is out here, particularly men's gymnastics. And it was really, I was just amazed. These people were doing things that, to me, did not seem to be humanly possible. And just to foreshadow, it turned out they were not. But I decided I want to learn how to do this. So 70s, New Jersey, boys gymnastics just wasn't a thing. So I went to the coach of the girls gymnastics team and asked her, can I work out, practice with the girls team? Of course, she said no. Title IX wasn't really a thing back then either. And frankly, I think she was suspicious of my motivations. But instead, I joined the Y. Our Y had a couple nights a week where you could pull out the equipment and do whatever you wanted. So you could use the gymnastics equipment. I went to the library. I took out a book on how to become a gymnast. And I set out to teach myself gymnastics. And I really put a lot of time into this, 2 or 3 times a week, a couple hours at the Y in the evening. During the day, in class, I was practicing splits and handstands. In retrospect, it probably was not helping my quest to get a date with my future wife. But I really persisted with this. And at the end of 3 years, I was still really lousy at gymnastics. So what was missing here? Well, a couple of obvious things, a coach and a spotter. So there was no way that I could overcome my evolutionary sound fear of dying in order to try things that would advance my skills. And I had no coach who could tell me what I was doing wrong. So in medical education, we have those things. When a resident is supervising an intern, putting a line in, they're there to coach them, to take over if it looks like things are going the wrong way, to spot for them. When an attending listens to a student give a presentation on rounds, they can give them feedback to help improve them. So persistence, passion has to occur in a setting in which there is also feedback and safety. And one of the simplifications of Ericsson's model is that it doesn't account for talent. So this notion of 10,000 hours, it was picked up by Malcolm Gladwell, by Daniel Kahneman, Daniel Pink, and it's been really simplified down to all it takes is 10,000 hours. Anyone can be an expert in anything if you just put the time in. And it's perhaps reassuring for me to know that I could have been an Olympic gymnast. I just didn't have enough time. But I think it runs counter to common sense. There is some aspect of intrinsic talent, and just dichotomizing this into something that you're born with or something that you can practice yourself into is really kind of silly. And this is a study of chess masters, 104 Argentinian chess masters. And chess masters are kind of the lab rats of skill acquisition because they're all rated by a fairly objective standardized scale that's used around the world. And this shows the log of their hours of individual practice and chess team practice against their expertise. And just like Anderson showed, there is certainly a statistically significant regression here. But look at the variance around regression. That's where the message is. Only about 24 to 30% of the variability in skill level is explained by differences in practice. Some of these experts took 3,000 hours of practice to become chess masters. Others had to work at it for 20,000 hours. So there is some aspect of intrinsic talent that relates to or predicts or contributes to the speed with which skill is attained. And that's really the basis for the concept of competency-based medical education. The expectation that everyone will achieve the same level of competence in all of the multiple domains reflected in the milestones, but that individuals are going to achieve them at different rates. That was a lesson that I also learned the hard way. So I'll continue with my story of my athletic career. When I got to college, I went to tryouts for the gymnastics team. I took a look around at all of the stuff that everybody else was doing, and I just slunk away, realizing that my years in high school had largely been wasted. But a few months later, I was playing a pickup volleyball game after dinner, and a typical pickup volleyball game, it was just awful. It was like full contact volleyball. But there was one player who, he just looked serene. He looked like he could levitate, and the ball would float away from his hands. And I was amazed. I hadn't been that amazed since I'd seen gymnastics on TV. So I went to him afterwards, and I said, how do you do that? And this being the 70s, he said, with serenity. And so I said, well, can I learn how to do that? And he looked me up and down, and he said, well, are you serene? Freshman in college, I was about as serene as a puppy on crack. But I swore up and down, yeah, it's my middle name. So he invited me to go to try out for the club volleyball team. And it was a club team. It was very open. It was willing to accept somebody who really had never played volleyball before. But I joined the team, and there I had a coach. I had a community of people who were already very passionate about volleyball, and I put in the hours. I spent more time practicing with this team, my new family, than I had ever done on my own with gymnastics, and I started to improve. Over time, I got better and better at playing volleyball, such that by my senior year, I was elected the team manager. So, if you're familiar with particularly club sports, being elected the manager means that you're lousy at the sport, but you have a car. And so I was happy to carpool people to the tournaments and, carry the balls and that sort of thing. So it seemed like all the elements in place, but what was missing? Well, a foot of height. So another lesson here is that you have to generalize it. There are talents, intrinsic talents, that are necessary for success, and you have to be aware when you have them or lack them. So self-awareness is critically important here. And clearly, I thought I was a lot taller than I was. I still suffer from that, but having these intrinsic talents are important. Now, we can speculate a lot about what those intrinsic characteristics are for success in medicine. I think we can come up with a lot of ideas. But I think the conclusion here is that there's something intrinsic and something related to practice in the right community, with passionate people, with safety and with coaching. So now let me talk a little bit about how we might teach more adaptive responses to failure. So for many, many years, you have all been told you have to find your passion. I want to tell you, don't try to find your passion. I think that that's a recipe for just disappointment. People expect that passion is just going to hit them, but it's not. It's something that's built over time. And if you look for it, it's going to prove very elusive. But we've all been told this so often. So we interview about 60 applicants for our fellowship program. I did a word search on the ERAS application of the people that we invited for interviews. 73% of the applications mentioned passion somewhere in there, in the personal statement or one of the letters of reference. It was more frequent than the mention of compassion. So just for comparison, I looked at 60 applications of people that we didn't invite for fellowship. 65% of them also mentioned passion, and by chi-square testing, there was no difference between those two. So you don't have to put the word passion in your application. But we have this very high expectation that I think it's kind of a recipe for disappointment. My suggestion is to find something interesting and stick to it. If you spend your time trying to discover something that you're already passionate about, it's not going to happen. Passion is an outcome. It's not an input variable to a successful career. So find things that repulse you and avoid them. But to go from interesting to passion, look for something that you find meaningful, something for which there is a role model that you admire, that you aspire toward, and for which there's a community of people who are already passionate about it. And then give it time, and chances are the passion will grow. I've seen that happen to hundreds of fellows now. Another approach that we as educators can take is to let our trainees know about all the things that we have failed about. So we celebrate our successes. Someone got a grant, someone got a paper in, someone's got an award, someone's been invited to give the Butler lecture. That's terrific. But the problem with that is that for junior trainees, it makes it look like it was easy. And they look at their failures and it just kind of amplifies them. It says, how can I ever succeed at this? So I think we should do more to share our failures. And this was actually suggested by a woman writing in a blog in Nature. And what she suggested is that people start keeping a CV of their failures. I sort of wish that I had done that. I would have had to start when I was much younger. For one thing, it would have accumulated a lot more quickly than everything on my CV of success. And it's very hard for me to reproduce it now because I've suppressed most of my failures. I don't remember them. Even I am starting to believe that, gee, it was easy. So you have to start early. And this was actually done by Johannes Haushofer. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Princeton. He started his CV with the typical sections of a CV, but with the modifications, the degree programs he got rejected from, all the grant rejections and paper rejections, and then he posted it on the internet. Kind of a bold thing to do. And it went viral. It got a lot of press attention, and it led him to add one other entry, which is the meta-failure, that his CV of failures has gotten more attention than his entire body of academic work. So I would suggest that you start collecting this now, but don't put it up on the internet just yet. The problem with when you start this, you're in a very junior and insecure position. You don't know how things are going to turn out. When I was asking my future wife out for the umpteenth time and being turned down, I didn't know if this was going to turn into the family lore that Hank is persistent or the family lore that Hank is pathetic. But you need to start writing it down now or you will forget it later. Another approach we can take is to reframe successes to emphasize the struggle that it took to get there. And this was studied in a group of 400 9th and 10th grade students in New York City. They came from a range of socioeconomic classes, and most of them were minority students. Most of them were poor. And they were assigned to read an 800-word story about Madame Curie, Einstein, or Michael Faraday. And the stories were also randomized to be stories about their personal struggles, growing up in poverty, and doing poorly in school, their scientific struggles, or a more typical story about how much they had achieved and contributed to medicine. The outcome was these students' science grades 6 weeks before compared to 6 weeks after reading this essay. And they also did surveys and interviews of the students. They found that the students who read these stories of achievements, their grades just declined, consistent with the class mean. So this really tells you about what science class is like in middle school. The students who read the struggle stories, their grades improved, and it was particularly true in the low-performing students. But they weren't able to find any change in their attitudes about effort or intelligence or their various mindsets. But just knowing that successful people had to struggle seemed to motivate them to succeed themselves. We can also reframe criticism when we give it. So this was a study that was done in 44 suburban middle school students who were basically B and C students. They had a middle school curriculum block about heroes, and at the end of the block they had to write an essay about a personal hero. And it was a very structured assignment, 5 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 had to be about this, paragraph 2 had to be about that. It really just brought to mind everything I hated about middle school. But these were then graded by their teacher, who wrote extensive comments, as was typical for this teacher, about things that they did right, things that they could consider revising. And the teacher had also written on 44 Post-it notes. On half of them she wrote, "I'm giving you these comments so that you'll have feedback on your paper." On the other half, she wrote, "I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know that you can reach them." And then the investigators randomly just pasted this on the essays. The teachers didn't know who got which Post-it note. The students didn't know what was told to the other students. And then they looked, and they were all given the option to revise and resubmit their paper. And they looked at the impact of this on the likelihood of students submitting a revised paper. And the odds ratio of submitting an odds paper was 4.6. So enormous influence on the likelihood to try revising the paper. And the number of edits in the papers that were revised and resubmitted were twice as many in the students that got the feedback, coupled with the high expectations. The authors speculate that this message helped build trust between the students and the teacher. Trust is notoriously low, particularly in African American students in high school. So it's speculative, but it has led me to try to change the way I give feedback to trainees at the end of a rotation in a simple way. Instead of saying, "Today is your last day or my last day on the rotation, let's sit down so I can give you some feedback," I try to say, "Let's sit down so I can give you some feedback on ways that will make you even better the next time you're here." And I say, I try to phrase it that way because I even fail at this. But when I remember it, that's how I try to phrase it. Now, Harvard wants to be the best in everything, including failure. So they have devoted a website to this, what they call the Success Failure Project. It's something that's developed by the Bureau of Study Council. It's a very Orwellian sounding name. I don't know what that office does. But part of this website it's sort of a variation on the CV of Failures theme. They have little video vignettes of successful Harvard professors, student leaders, deans, administrators, just record little videos about times when they face planted in their career or their lives and how they recovered from that. They've even published a how-to guide. Now, a lot of Harvard students, they may encounter the first B in their life when they come to Harvard and take their physics exam. So, I can see that there would be a big need for this. But the 5 steps that they recommend is, first, feel bad. Allow yourself to feel miserable about it. Don't try to just dust yourself off. Think back about what happened and try to learn to see the signs of impending failure. So next time around, you might be able to intervene early. Admit the truth. You failed. It wasn't some external factor. Don't sugarcoat it. And then sit down and try to articulate, even write down what you think you've learned from that experience. And then go out and do it again. with the expectation that eventually you will succeed. So I'd like to offer my How to Fail guide. The first is to get a coach and a spotter. In medicine, we call those mentors. I've had several, had mentors in fellowship that have become friends, colleagues, but they remain trusted advisors throughout my career. They are essential to succeed. I suggest you practice some sort of cognitive hygiene. That is, recognize failure is not a condemnation of your abilities or your eventual success. It's not a personal series of insults. It's necessary, and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to figure out how to do it better. And try to cultivate that growth mindset. To the extent possible, remind yourself that abilities can be improved with practice and experience. I suggest you start a CV of failure. I suggest you don't put it up on Facebook. But I also suggest you start a portfolio of happiness. That is to say, when you get a letter of thanks from a grateful patient, when the division chief writes you a letter saying you did so-and-so well, when you get an award, get good evaluations for your teaching, just throw these in a manila folder. Just stick them in there and check that a lot more frequently than you check your CV of failure. Certainly, whenever you have something that's eligible to be put on the CV of failure, review your portfolio of happiness to remind yourself that failure is not all that you got. And then go out there and fail again. So I'll end with this kind of caveat. You have to know when to quit. And I don't have firm advice on that, but clearly there is a line when being the guy who never gives up becomes the stubborn fool. And it's tough to recognize when you've crossed that line. But I think, a few markers that may suggest that. It may occur as a result of external forces. The NIH funding priorities change, and so, you have to, your lab's going to close, you have to change your approach to research. That's sort of what happened to me as an investigator in heart-lung interactions. Maybe the externality is that you have a child, and you really have to reorder your life priorities. Another warning sign is that there's no longer joy in the actual process of working towards success. So if what you're doing day after day just becomes drudgery, if it starts to induce burnout, then maybe that's time to reassess and redirect. And finally, if the ultimate destination starts to lose its appeal, maybe you start out wanting to be one role model that you've identified, but as you approach that role model or get to know what that lifestyle means, maybe there's another model that you want to aim for. I think these are all suggestions that maybe it's time to redirect your career and start failing in another domain. So I end with this quote. I want to thank you again so much for inviting me to give the John Butler lecture. I'm very honored to be here, and I would be happy to fail to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. That was phenomenal. My question is about patients' personality and their personal history of grit. Has that ever been studied to correlate with, say, surviving cancer or surviving septic shock? I like to think that my patient's attitude play a role in their recovery.
So I did not come up with anything that looked at patient outcomes and how they correlate with grit. That sounds like a fantastic thing to study. There are very few studies related to medical education. I cited one, but there's really only a couple of others. But those are all looking at trainees. I don't recall seeing anything related to patients.
actually had a question. In the young training, how do you coach people in assessing their failure and recognizing it and learning from it as opposed to allowing it to really bring them down? I mean, how do you coach someone through that?
So I think one tactic is to give them examples from your own life. Ways in which you have failed and ways in which you recovered from it. If it's a grant, for example, remind them that 4 out of 5 grants are not funded the first time. If it's a patient who did poorly, you can talk about the things that they did right and the fact that sometimes patients don't always respond.
Thank you, Hank. I feel like you've shared so much, I can call you Hank now. That was excellent. I noticed in the GRIT discussions, a lot of the studies that were done were primarily of male-dominated areas. So there was the military, there were surgical trainees. This is not a loaded question, I promise. I'm just in the world of academic medicine. We face a very real issue of women faculty dropping out before reaching the upper echelons of academic success. Air quotes, everybody, success. And I'm curious whether any of the research that you came across discussed gender differences in this concept of grit and how it affects long-term outcomes.
So in Duckworth's study, probably the largest number of subjects who've been studied, it did not differ by gender. So the degree of grit did not differ by gender. The only other study that seemed to address that was the divorce study that I alluded to, in which grit predicted the likelihood of remaining married in men but not women.
Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.